We'll just be a minute, I'm waiting. Okay, okay, we're ready to go. Awesome. Good day, everyone. Welcome. We're so glad that you're here. My name is Ann McCaig, and I'm the project director on this webinar series. This series is a partnership, Youth Justice Wisconsin, a partnership between Youth Justice Milwaukee and Kids Forward in Madison. And a big thank you to the Juvenile Law Center for hosting on their Zoom platform and managing the technical aspects, as well as being an incredible subject matter partner. A diverse set of local, state, and national partners came together to make these panels possible, and you'll be meeting all of them over the course of these webinars. As questions and reactions arise, please post them in the Q&A box, and at the end, we've reserved time to take on as many as we can. The session is going to be recorded, and the materials will be shared next week. We wanted to put together a brief three-question poll to get a sense of who's in the room here today and where you're from. And so I'm going to have Katrina, I'm going to ask her to post that. Awesome. And we'll give you a minute to go through those. And as we're doing that, I'd like to frame up the series for you so you know what to expect. We're really excited about this series, and it's been really great to work together on it. We have intentionally created panels that represent lived experience, national perspective, and Wisconsin centered around emerging adults, young people, ages 18 to 24. This is an overlooked population, and it reflects the highest racial disparities in the criminal justice system. For those of us that are not directly impacted by mass incarceration of youth, hearing personal stories is one of the only ways to see and hear how policy and data reflect a person's life and impact a person's life. When we talk about the problem of mass incarceration of youth, we're talking about millions of lives impacted every day. So these panels will challenge you to think differently. It will be uncomfortable, and it should be, because this truth is tragic. We want to create a community around this truth and discomfort to work for needed change. For Black, Indigenous, and people of color, this truth is not hard to imagine, and it's personally traumatic. Mass incarceration continues to devastate families and drain communities of good minds and hearts. It doesn't have to be this way, and that's why we're here today, and we look forward to seeing you over the course of the next 8 weeks. We can recreate public policy and budgets to eliminate the root causes of youth incarceration. Focusing on emerging adults is a key to ending this cycle and creating intergenerational well-being across the Wisconsin. And we are not the first group to come forward to focus on this issue. We hope that as this webinar series progresses, we will find new partners and add to our coalition and movement. So with that, I'd like to check in on the results of the poll, and we can see who's in our group today. Katrina,
Yes.
can you share that?
Yes, I'll give 5 more seconds and then I'll end the polling. All right. Thank you all so much for participating in that. I'm sharing the results now. You should be able to see those on your screen. It looks like a lot of Wisconsin representation here and a lot of folks from outside of Wisconsin. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. Looks like a wide range of roles as well. A few people, elected officials, are working with elected officials, some government representation. And then our final question, do you feel directly impacted by the issue of youth justice for emerging adults? Majority of you said yes, and some folks unsure. Maybe you're here to learn, and we'll be able to have the conversation today. So thank you so much for participating in that. I'll go ahead and close that out.
Right. And I'm going to officially hand it over to Katrina to kick off the panel. We have 3 speakers today. We will transition between them with a short introduction. Katrina Goodshoit is a staff attorney at the Juvenile Law Center and an incredible partner on this project. I'll let her introduce herself a little bit more and the work that she's been contributing to the nation and definitely to the Midwest over the past few years. Katrina.
Great. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Katrina Goodshoit. I'm a staff attorney at Juvenile Law Center. I work on our youth and the adult system team, where we work to end harsh sentencing for young people who are processed in the adult system. So I will be sharing my screen, do a little PowerPoint for you all. Give me 1 second to pull this up. Great. Should be able to see that now. So as Anne mentioned, last September, Juvenile Law Center released a report entitled Rethinking Emerging Adult Justice for Emerging Adults, Spotlight on the Great Lakes region. So we focused on 6 states in the Great Lakes region, and I'll just pull out kind of the global takeaways from that report, but we'll be sure to share that report with you as well as other resources after our webinar. So you've heard this term come up a number of times. So who are emerging adults? Who are we talking about? So generally speaking, we're talking about 18 to 24-year-olds. There is some discussion about whether, the age range should end at 24, 25, 30, but generally speaking, that's what we're talking about. And research has shown that emerging adults share some of the key characteristics as adolescents, so younger adolescents, so that immaturity, susceptibility to peer pressure, lack of impulse control, risk-seeking, risk-taking behavior, very similar to younger adolescents. And research also shows tremendous potential growth for this growth and opportunity for this age range. So their brains are still developing, so they're very amenable to rehabilitation with the right supports and services, which is another reason why we want to talk about them today. So why focus on this population? As Anne mentioned, the recidivism rates are highest for emerging adults in this country. In 2012, which was the last year that the Department of Justice kept track of age at time of the offense, when entering incarceration, emerging adults accounted for 9% of the US population, but 21% of prison admissions and more than 23% of arrests in this country. So very, very highly, they're overrepresented and over-policed, and mass incarceration, addressing mass incarceration will necessarily require looking at this age group. Racial disparities, as Anne mentioned, are also particularly high in this age group. I'll give a few examples as I share the global takeaways from the 6 states we looked at in our report. But just one thing to notice as we're thinking about trying to address some of those racial disparities. And session 3 of our webinar series will go more in depth into this, but I'll just give you a little preview today. So Illinois was one of the states that we looked at, and Black male emerging adults are 9.5 times more likely to be incarcerated than their white peers. So overrepresented, overpoliced, a number of reasons for this number. Some of the policies we saw, policies and programs in Illinois addressed specifically for emerging adults. Young people under the age of 21 who commit offense and have served 10 years are eligible for parole review. And then Cook County Jail, so that's the Chicago area, there is a program that houses 18 to 24-year-olds in a separate housing unit and provides services specifically for those individuals. And there's a restorative justice court just outside of Chicago as well, where young people under the age of 26 can participate in this program and get a conviction will get their cases diverted. So they would be able to get the charge off of their record. The next state we looked at was Indiana. We didn't have emerging adult specific data for Indiana that we were able to find, but this data here shows that racial disparities are very high for the general population in Indiana. So it's probably, safe to assume that these disparities would be higher, will be the same if not higher for emerging adults. So some of the programs and policies we saw in Indiana, Indiana is one of only 3 states in the country that allows young people in the justice system to still participate in extended foster care and so receive services up to age 21. And we also saw a number of different rental housing and supportive services for young people up to age 25 who are experiencing homelessness. So specific programs targeted at that age group, as well as some mental health and behavioral care programs. So we are able to see a number of children's hospitals that actually have emerging adult programs for 18 to 25-year-olds to specifically get services directly for those groups. And then Michigan was next. So similar to the other states we were talking about, seeing the high overrepresentation of emerging adults in the system. So in 2018, they represented almost 10% of the total population, and yet 22% of all arrests in the state. So very, very high overrepresentation as well. And recently, the past couple years, Michigan actually raised the age of juvenile court jurisdiction. So that means 17-year-olds who are no longer automatically transferred to the adult system. So now the age is 18, and so that was a great move that we saw happen recently there. And Michigan also has a long-standing youthful offender law that allows young people up to 21 to avoid a criminal conviction if they participate in a number of different conditions and meet a number of different requirements. They're able to do that. And similar to Illinois, we found a diversion court for young adults. This one for young people between the ages of 17 and 20. And Michigan also doesn't have mandatory minimum sentences for certain offenses, for example, illegal gun possession. And, as we know, mandatory minimums are one of the driving forces behind mass incarceration when judges aren't able to have the discretion in sentencing and having to impose these really harsh sentences. So the next state we looked at was Minnesota. Again, as we mentioned in the other states, just seeing the higher overrepresentation of emerging adults as offenders, as well as the victims impacted by crime. And Minnesota, we didn't see too many programs or practices specifically targeting emerging adults, but some of these policies affect emerging adults as well as the whole population. So Minnesota doesn't have mandatory minimum sentences for low-level controlled substance offenses. And in 2015, there was a significant investment, about $47 million, that the state legislature put aside specifically for mental health services. And we'll talk about this in session 2, but emerging adults are seeing some of the highest rates of mental illness in this country. And so also saw some young adult units in several hospitals as well. So Ohio was another state that we looked at, similar to Michigan, just seeing this overrepresentation of young people in prison admissions. And Ohio, actually, of all the Great Lakes states that we looked at, had the largest incarcerated population, almost 50,000 people currently in Ohio in facilities around the state. And Ohio still has the death penalty, and they are one of just 4 states that are responsible for more than 3/4 of all executions of people who committed their offenses between the ages of 18 and 21. So really, really high numbers there. And then also saw some mental health and addiction services for young people between the ages of 14 and 25. There's an online list of resources that folks are able to access. And then Wisconsin, Erica will talk a little bit more about Wisconsin, but just kind of globally, I'll pull out some of the highlights. So we saw that the daily prison population was steadily increasing between 2000 and 2016. So over those 2 decades, the number of folks being incarcerated going up. And in this state, we saw also that emerging adults are the only age group where Black individuals who are incarcerated are not only overrepresented, but actually outnumber white individuals who are incarcerated. So very, very high disparities there. And just really quickly, some of the highlights of Wisconsin. So highlights doesn't necessarily mean a good thing. Wisconsin has not raised the age of juvenile court jurisdiction. Just one of 3 states in the whole country, Georgia and Texas are the other 2, that haven't raised the age to 18. So 17-year-olds are still treated as adults regardless of the circumstances. And there is a specific expungement provision on the record where young people who are under 25 at the time of their offense, the court can automatically order that the sentence will be, or excuse me, that the record will be expunged upon completion of the sentence. And Medicaid hasn't been expanded under the Affordable Care Act, so there's some access to healthcare issues for young people, especially low-income emerging adults. And we'll talk more about this in session 3, but emerging adults have some of the highest rates of untreated mental illness and suicide in Wisconsin. So thank you so much. Let me stop sharing my screen and then I will pass it right back to you, Anne. Thank you. Anne, you are muted.
You know it has to happen at some point today. Thank you so much, Katrina. This underscores why we are here today and why we'll continue to gather. So we've given you kind of the overview of where Wisconsin is in the Midwest region. Our next speaker is Dominic Meek from Milwaukee. He will be sharing his personal experience being incarcerated as a 15-year-old sentenced to life. We met through his work with the Wisconsin Alliance for Youth Justice, an advocacy group to eliminate juvenile life without parole, which is part of our current juvenile justice code in Wisconsin. In Dominic's story, you'll hear underlying factors that led him into the system and insights on what he needed that the system was not designed to provide. No one should experience these things, but we can't hide from the truth that too many do. And so we have to start from the place of that truth. Thanks to Dominic for being willing to share your truth today. And I will hand it over to him at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, my name is Dominic. As Anne said, I was sentenced to life in prison at the age of 15 years old for first-degree intentional homicide. Katrina in her presentation gave us statistics, and I am the face. I don't know a lot of the statistics, things like that, but I am the face. I remember when I was incarcerated, when I was the early years of my sentence, every juvenile I met in prison was Black, you know, or later on a couple Latinos, Latinx, but primarily Black. So I am that face of the overly incarcerated juvenile. But the question that I want to answer is how I got to that point so that hopefully we can help prevent another juvenile from experiencing what I did. So I grew up in Milwaukee in a pretty violent household. My parents divorced at an early age when I was young, and I went to stay with my father. My father, he became addicted to drugs and was an alcoholic, which brought a lot of violence. As I said, brought a lot of violence around me. As a child, I experienced not just physical abuse, but also mental, emotional, and even sexual abuse from various adults in my life. This, as is well known, brought out, gave me an exceedingly sense of low self-esteem. I did not like myself. I did not love myself. I blamed myself for what was going on and felt that If I was better, then none of the things that was happening to me would happen. Being unable to do anything about it, though, to even change myself to prevent it from happening or to stop it from happening, I also had a growing sense of anger. I would even go so far as to say rage. And to deal with the rage and to deal with the pain and the anger that I felt from what I was experiencing, and from not the lack of love I have for myself, I used to hurt myself in secret. I was a cutter. I burned myself. But what I most often did was when the pain became too much for me to deal with, I would go outside when nobody was around, and I would just get to punching brick walls, especially the foundation stones of houses that were in my neighborhood across the alley. And I would punch them and I would scream and I would holler and I would shout until I couldn't punch them no more, until the pain from punching them walls temporarily at least covered the pain that I was feeling inside at my circumstances. Um, the thing though is that eventually the pain would go away and the wounds would heal. But the pain I felt on the inside was still there. And I didn't know how to deal with that. But I started watching my older brother, who was my idol, and he wasn't going through the things I was going through. It didn't seem so to me anyway. And I so much wanted to be like him. I wanted to be tough like he was. I wanted to be popular like he was. I was tired of being hurt, and he wasn't being hurt. And in my mind at that time, it was primarily because he was a gang member. And so I told myself that if I became a gang member like my brother, then I would be able to stop being hurt as well. When I turned 14, I was expelled from school for fighting. And because it was between myself and an opposing gang member, and gang verbiage was thrown back and forth, it was considered a gang fight. And like I said, I was expelled. During my expulsion, soon after, about 2 weeks or so after I'd been expelled from school, my mother sent me to the store. And as she did, as I left the house, some of my friends, quote unquote, drove up and offered to take me instead of letting me walk. So I got in the car and we went to the store. And on the way there, we saw an individual from an opposing gang who I had been fighting with for about off and on for the last 6 months. And during my last fight with him, I had told him that he was no longer allowed to be in my neighborhood no more. And if I saw him again, then, he would get beat up or whatever would happen, but he couldn't come back around. When we saw him, the guys in the car asked me, why was he there? Because they knew what I had said, the streets talk. And I was like, I don't know, what I'm saying? But now I'm starting to feel angry and I'm starting to feel disrespected. I'm starting to feel hurt by his disrespect. How dare he come back in my neighborhood when I told him not to? How dare he disrespect me in front of my friends? How dare he hurt me again? So I'm feeling angry. And we don't even go to the store this time. We pull up in front of this man. His name was Lawrence, and I give his name because it's public record. His name was Lawrence. And we get out the car and surround him. And I proceed to beat him. And unlike previous times when Lawrence and I fought, he don't fight back because he know that if he fight back, he's going to take an even worse beating from my friends. After I beat Lawrence, we got in the car and drove away. And as we drove away, one of the men in the car had mentioned that they were tired of me having to deal with Lawrence and the issues I was having with him. And then he said, you know what, somebody need to kill him. And then he asked who would kill him. And it was quiet in the car. And while everybody thought about it, in my head, the thoughts went through. The two thoughts I distinctly remember having was, A, that if I said I would kill him, then it would make me a man. And B, that I would belong. Even though I've been a gang member by this time for over a year, I felt that I didn't belong. Again, it's the results of everything I felt prior to that from what I was going through. So I said I would do it. And we went and got a gun. And we came back to the scene where I had beat Lawrence, and he had moved down a block a ways. And he was surrounded by a group of people who were looking over his injuries. And I got out the car and I walked through the crowd of people. And I pointed the gun at Lawrence's head. And I pulled the trigger twice. I missed Lawrence and I killed another man instead. I didn't notice at the time, but so thinking I had killed Lawrence, I got in the car, got back in the car, and we drove off. And I went on a run for 2 weeks before I finally stopped running and turned myself into the police. Upon my entry to the juvenile justice system, and this was only like my third interaction with the law, even though I had been doing a lot of gang banging and things like that. Upon my introduction to the juvenile justice system, I was there for 4 months before I was waiting to adult court. And then when I was sent to the county jail, I was there for another 5 months before I ultimately pled guilty to first degree intentional homicide. And then 2 days later, on my 16th birthday, I was shipped off to Dodge Correctional Institution to start my prison sentence, where I ultimately spent approximately 28 years, a little less, about 27 years and some months altogether from that day. But spent 28 years total in prison. And my time in prison, see, and this is this thing, and I have never been so lonely or so scared in my life. And I'm not saying that I didn't deserve to be held accountable for what I did. What I did was definitely wrong and definitely harmed a whole lot of people. I don't believe that no juvenile should be placed among adults, first of all. And secondly, I don't believe that any juvenile should be given life sentences. We should be thrown away. What the courts did when they gave me a life sentence was tell me that I was worthless and that I could not change, and that it didn't give me no reason to hope. Thankfully, I found it within myself and with the help of some other guys that I met in prison to change, but it was hard. You know, nothing in my early years of my incarceration was conducive to that change. Not the guys I saw. I'm 135 pounds at the time, skinny, pimple-faced teenager with grown men, with men who are in there for numerous rapes, numerous murders. They beat people up in prison. They selling drugs in prison. They're violating others in prison, sexually, physically, and all the other things like that. And I am surrounded by these. And it's only, if any good thing came from my brothers being a gang member, it's the fact that he was able to reach out from another prison and protect me, have me protected. Those who I met in prison who did not do that, some of them are still in prison today because of the things they had to do to survive. And this is what happens when we sentence young men and women to adult time and place them among adults. I did not get the psychiatric help I needed to deal with the issues that led to my incarceration. None of these things happened until I was later on in my bit, when I finally acknowledged the pain I went through, the things I suffered, things like that. I ultimately changed. So many of my guys have not. Like I said, they still in prison. And that's why I do this, for them, and to complete others for walking in my steps. So if you take anything from me, I am that face. Picture me that time, 28, now almost 29 years ago. And I hope that we all work together to prevent another me from happening. Please. Thank you. With that, I turn it back to Ann.
Thank you so much, Dominique. It's a really powerful story every time I hear it. And I think it will make a difference. In your story, I hear the impact of our current juvenile justice code. I hear the impact of community disinvestment and mass incarceration, and the impact of trauma that leads you into more serious situations. The truth is, we have the opportunity to make changes that address every piece of Dominique's experience. And as he said, by doing so, we prevent the trauma for somebody else and reduce the need for prisons. And to talk about that type of action, that we want to frame up for the rest of the series. I'd like to introduce Erica Nelson, Advocacy Director of Kids Forward in Madison. Thanks, Erica.
Thank you, Anne. I just, still taking a deep breath and a moment to appreciate the powerfulness of what Dominique has shared. And I'd also like to thank Anne and Katrina for your contributions to this work, and all of you who are here today to sort of learn more and think about it. And I want to just take a quick moment to reiterate what all three folks have said in different ways today. And I think it's that the people, the place, and the policy really, really matters. Had different policies, approaches, and systems been in place at the time that Dominique was 14 or 15 or 16, his life and the life of many other youth, and in particular young men of color, would have been drastically different. Dominique's lived experience and those of others clearly indicates what we should have done, and in essence, how we sort of failed as a community to ease the trauma and the pain of young folks. And that we had the opportunity to prevent far too many at this point of an entire generation of Black men and boys from over-incarceration in the state of Wisconsin. So I am, if Katrina has a moment to share her screen, I am just gonna take a few moments to talk about the landscape. That's the roadmap. But the one before it, the landscape of where we are in the state of Wisconsin. Yeah, great. In terms of youth justice reform. And Wisconsin has made real progress in the last 3 decades to reduce the number of youth in the juvenile justice system, but it has made very little progress on reducing racial disparities. And in some cases, like I believe Katrina pointed out, they've actually increased. White youth have predominantly seen the positive impacts of reform, while Black and brown youth have remained entangled in the system. In fact, Black youth are 15 times more likely to be in detention than their white counterparts here in the state of Wisconsin. And emerging adults in Wisconsin, like elsewhere in the nation, represent a large portion of those incarcerated. And while the state of Wisconsin has 6.2% a Black population, 52% were Black and either 24 or under in 2018 of those that were incarcerated. So if we as a state of Wisconsin, who faces numerous racial disparities in a lot of different areas, want to address them in terms of employment, health, education, we also have to take the time to address this population as well. Moreover, if we want to increase community safety, we have to recognize that locking up 18 to 24-year-olds or emerging adults actually increases recidivism and thus actually undermines community safety. In Wisconsin, almost half of the offenders aged 24 or younger at the time of their offense were re-incarcerated within 3 years. And that's as compared to 34% of the overall offenders. So incarcerating this age group is not actually making us safer. So one of the other things I want to talk about in terms of the state of Wisconsin, in addition to the disparities, is that our failure to implement needed reforms in the youth justice system means that we're sort of woefully behind other states, as Katrina pointed out, the Great Lakes and the nation, in terms of making adequate support for youth and emerging adults. How we treat our juveniles, our youth, and our children is also indicative of how we're going to invest in preparing them for young adulthood or for that age period of emerging adulthood. As Katrina mentioned, we are only one of 3 states that is yet to raise the age of juvenile jurisdiction to 17. Again, that's the other states are Georgia, who I believe will be on the cusp of passing that this spring, and Texas. In addition, the age of delinquency in Wisconsin is the age of 10 as opposed to 12. So we need to have an acknowledgement that a 10-year-old is very much a child. and that we need to increase the age of delinquency to 12. And we have to make many other needed changes, including eliminating juvenile life without parole, and then reviewing and rewriting our juvenile justice code in the state, which hasn't been rewritten since, I believe, the early 1990s. And then lastly, in terms of our current landscape, we have to work to close Lincoln Hills and Copper Lake, which are our two secure facilities. In 2017, Act 185 was a response to civil rights violations and abuses of youth who were in Lincoln Hills. And in the Act 185, they moved to close Lincoln Hills as well as create a model for youth justice in the state of Wisconsin. Notably, the date for closure of Lincoln Hills and Copper Lake was supposed to be July 2021. That has since been delayed. And yet, I believe somewhere, and I'm sure there's people on this webinar that can tell the exact numbers, but around the average daily population for Lincoln Hills and Copper Lake is around 60. And that's, very few youth. And many of those youth are in there and in the secure placement because we do not have adequate investment and placement that meets their mental health needs. So in other words, we can't make secure placement default to house children who have high needs, but we really need to work to construct and build a system that meets their needs. So that's sort of the current landscape and maybe a little bit discouraging, but I think what's next, is that we have new momentum and a renewed commitment to building a better youth justice system in the state of Wisconsin. So let me just briefly talk to that, unless you're cutting me off, Anne. Are you cutting? Okay. Just want to make sure I'm the same. Okay. So the next slide, Katrina, if you could. So there's a roadmap to transformative youth justice reform in Wisconsin. And I think one of those key pieces is to act as a state and coalition and individuals with urgency and sincerity about implementing the Wisconsin model for juvenile justice. Again, these are models that these points came out of the Act 185 legislation and elected officials here in the state of Wisconsin. We need to address racial disparities immediately. That can't be said enough. We say it over and over again. That has to be the focus. Emphasize prevention and diversion, enhance our program effectiveness to meet the needs of these youth, and work to provide them the supports that they need when they're transitioning home, and think about how we engage the community, those that are impacted, and what we mean by community safety. So that's really important as we move forward. Next bullet. I think it's critical, talking about new momentum and a commitment to advancing juvenile justice reform here in the state. We need to build broad public and political will for transformative reform. That means education and advocacy. That means expressing and sharing and having opportunity to say why it's important to make reforms in this state and address this population. And we're going to do that through having webinars like this in this continued series, as well as Youth Justice Wisconsin and other collaborations that we're working with. And then looking to the future, what are the things that we can do immediately? We can build on the impact of COVID protocols that dramatically reduced the detention population in the state of Wisconsin by over 50 or nearly 50% as compared to a similar time pre-COVID. We need to spend some time as a community and stakeholders and officials saying, what worked in reducing this population and why it worked, and not retract to the prior status quo, but really build on the innovation, the creativity, and the commitment that came as a consequence of having to implement different protocols out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And, speaking, these may seem redundant, but this is really critical. We need to pass legislation in the states to raise the age, eliminate juvenile life without parole, close Lincoln Hill and Copper Lake, invest in prevention, especially around mental health treatment and diversion, and look to see what is the most appropriate sort of programs for those youth based on their development. And this is happening. I mean, the governor's budget, for example, has a lot of these proposals in place. So we can see that there is forward progression. And you know, the governor's budget does have raise the age to 18, delinquency raised to age 12, removing restraints for youth in court. There's a lot of movement happening here. And so lastly, I think it's probably like, oh, you've spent all this time on juvenile justice and not emerging adults. But I think that in the state of Wisconsin, I fundamentally believe that we have to work on both. And getting up to speed with the rest of the nation, so to speak, with respect to basic changes and approaches in juvenile justice is key. And simultaneously, we have to think about how we commit to not making the same mistakes of the past by waiting to address what is also right in front of us. And that is the growing need for support for this population of emerging adults, so that we can provide educational opportunities as opposed to carceral circumstances and punitive. We need to think about employment for this age group, family supports, housing. A high percentage of those between 18 and 24 find themselves homeless. You know, this, like I think Dominique said, you know, this and others have pointed out, this age group is a great time for influence and change and inspiration and molding. We as a community need to dismantle the structures and the systems that harm and hinder, and rather work to build foundations for youth and young adults that meets them where we know they're at developmentally, where we know where they're at, and what they themselves say they need to thrive. And that is our charge as a community and as a state going forward. So I hope that you all got a little something to take away from the three panelists, and I will conclude my presentation and hand it over to Anne. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Erica. So if any of you feel like your mind is overloading, your hearts are overloading, that's actually a good situation. This shouldn't, you know, and for those of you who are doing this work in various capacities and saying, oh, you forgot this, please put all that in the chat. Part of what we're doing, another project outside of this, is to collect and show how these complementary pieces of work going on in Wisconsin can fit together to not only move juvenile justice forward, but juvenile justice forward into relating to emerging adults. We don't want to really create a specialized system just for emerging adults. We want to provide that alternative system that helps everyone to get us to well-being. So we are running a few minutes behind, but we want to use our time for the question and answer period. And so I'm going to hand that over to Kyle Minden, who is a fellow at the Lutheran Office of Public Policy in Wisconsin and has been an incredible partner on this, as well as the coordinator for the Raise the Age Wisconsin Coalition. Thank you,
Thanks,
Kyle.
Anne. And thank you to Katrina, Erica, and Dominique for leading the panel today. I did want to go through a couple of questions that were put in the chat and in the Q&A function. I encourage everyone still to put any last questions that they have using the Q&A question. The first one that we came through was specifically during Katrina's presentation, but could be open to everyone. What do you mean by quote unquote over-policed?
Sure, I'll start and then folks can jump in. So when we say over-policed, what we're talking about are racialized policing patterns where, you know, you see that police are disproportionately in the communities that have higher populations of people of color, higher populations of low-income folks, and that intersectionality as well. And so that means they're more likely to, you know, stop people, stop and frisk, ticket, a number of different things like that show up as part of the racialized policing patterns.
Anyone else want to answer on that? Otherwise, we can move to the next question. All right, we have a question in the Q&A function. Can you speak a bit on the building of broad public and political will? What will that look like?
Sure. I think we're at the beginning of forming that. I think broad public and political will is really having the community and the voters and those who are making policy and doing advocacy understand the importance of this issue and not have it sort of narrowed into a small silo of just around criminal justice reform or just around juveniles, or but rather understand that, you know, what we do and do not do to support young folks, and in particularly young folks of color and emerging adults, does not just end in that space, but rather has just rippling effects for community health throughout, whether that's safety, whether that's long-term education, whether that's employment, whether, you know, I mean, in order for the state of Wisconsin to have a thriving future, we have to think about how we support all our youth and children and families. And I think so, one, it begins with education, and that's what this webinar is really about. I think emerging adults as both a area of focus is relatively new by comparison to some other areas. And so having these conversations and having a broader understanding is, and, you know, criminal justice reform in many ways in various states is also a bipartisan issue. So understanding how to, you know, achieve a greater political will around this issue is something that we hope to do in coalition and collaboration with all the folks on this call and in different agencies going forward.
Great. Well, we have a couple more questions. One that keeps coming up, and this one might direct it first to Katrina, is, are there any states or jurisdictions who are doing things well, at least relatively, or states that maybe Wisconsin should emulate?
That is a great question. Session 4 of our webinar series will really focus on some of these reform efforts, and in our report that I mentioned and that you all will have a link to, we talk about some of these reforms. I'll give an example of San Francisco. They have a specific emerging adult, young adult offender probation department. And so what that means is those probation officers are trained in trauma-informed practices, as well as a number of anti-racist policies, and that helps inform how they interact with the young people. And they also are trained to provide job skills and a number of other different things for the young people. So it's not necessarily a punitive approach to probation, it's more of a restorative, reformative approach. But there are a number of other reforms that we don't have time to talk about, but session 4, I highly encourage you to attend.
Great, thank you. Couple more questions before we wrap up. We've talked a lot about racial disparities, particularly here in Wisconsin. And so Alexandra asked, one question I have is related to your strategy to address racial disparities. Can you share any more specifics about what anti-racist policy changes you are pushing for?
Okay, I think I can answer the question. When you talk about, you know, one of the questions has been around raise the age, going from putting 17-year-olds back into the juvenile justice system. And in prior iterations of this proposal for legislation for the state of Wisconsin, there was carve-outs, there were repeated exceptions made in order to get 17-year-olds back into the juvenile justice system, including things like you were only eligible to go into the juvenile justice system if you were a first-time nonviolent offender. Okay, that set of circumstance, because of structural and systemic racism, by its very implementation, had the possibility of increasing racial disparities. In other words, white youth would take advantage of that space, first-time nonviolent offender, while African-American and other Black and Brown youth would not, because they are, as Katrina pointed out earlier, you know, over-policed, more likely to be charged differently, more likely to be accused of violent offenses, even, you know, so there's that. So that's an example of a specific policy in which you will achieve racial disparity reduction if you are cognizant of the impact of the policy on different populations. And we have to really think about targeting and making sure those policies don't have a negative disproportionate impact on kids of color or youth of color, while others are benefiting from a policy that doesn't take into account racial and structural racism. So that's an example right there that we're facing right in this moment here in the state of Wisconsin about reducing racial disparities. And there are a lot of other examples around that: fines and fees, status offenses, sending kids back to detention. Who's determining, you know, from a cultural competency space, who should be returned to detention for a status offense? I mean, there's a whole myriad of different ways to sort of target and reduce racial disparities in the system. We have to be intentional about it.
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks for everyone that had their questions in the chat. Unfortunately, we can't get to all of them, but I did have one more question for Dominique that came in that I think is really important. They ask, I live in another state. How can I help support and advocate for men and women that share your experience?
It's the same way you do the things to end racism. You speak up. When you see something, you speak up. Don't let the comments around you that you hear your family and friends make, speak up. You know, or better yet, think about it this way: what would you want done for your child? If it was your child who was experiencing what I and so many others have experienced, what would you want done? And do those very things. You know, because a lot of times we ask the question and it's someone else's child. Now it's too much money, or it's too much time to invest, or, you know, my job and all this. But I don't know nobody that wouldn't go to bat for their child to the moon and beyond. So do for this other child what you want done for your child, and as you do it, contact your legislators, of course. Go volunteer. Go into the communities where the disparities exist, where the children are being weighed into adult court. I talked to one white gentleman the other day, and he's like, "Yo, you can have such an impact." And he's like, I couldn't. And I was like, that's wrong. Everybody can reach somebody. You know what I'm saying? You just got to get out there and do it. You know, don't wait for me to come along or any of my fellow panelists to come along. Go there and ask a community there, a center there, hey, I want to help. How can I help? Get off the couch and get involved. And that's how you get best up. That's how you get best start. But thank you for being willing, and I hope you do so.
Yes, thank you. And I will pass it off to Anne for the closing. Anne, I think you're muted.
You are so right. I am totally muted, and now I'm not. Well, what you missed was me taking a deep breath and saying I'm really blown away by all the engagement here, and to think that we have 200 people gathering today, and that this is not the only space where this conversation is happening. So if we can keep connecting those spaces and keep them engaged, we can move forward. There's been lots of good input in the chat that we can respond to as a team over the course. That's partly why we wanted to do a series, and with a week in between, was to allow us to gather the resources to respond to interests and concerns. So we'll be working on that. We want each session to have a committed action that we ask of you, and a tangible takeaway that you take for yourself. And so the committed action we thought of for this week is to review the materials you're going to receive and tell somebody about this issue. Talk about what you've spent time on today. If it's part of your full-time work, it's okay. You can still talk about this experience today and where you can go with it. And in terms of your tangible takeaway, if you can put in the chat a word or two about what you're leaving with from this session, that will help us make sure that we're responding to interests and concerns for next time. And while you're doing that, I'm going to invite Lael Chester and Melissa Murphy, who are here today, and to give you a sneak peek for session 2 of what they're going to share with us.
Yeah, hi everybody. Very excited to be here. Our next session is going to be on March 11th in 2 weeks. Again, it will be at noon Central Time, and similar to this, it's free. Just register online, so you have the sign-in information. I want to, the topic of the next session is emerging adults. Why are they different? And I have the pleasure of sharing a little bit of information about the critical journey that all young people take, whether you're in the system or not in the system. When you transition as a child or a youth, that you're dependent on adults practically, emotionally, financially, to the journey and the bridge you make to adulthood when you are truly mature and independent. And if you remember your own trajectory, or you know anybody within this age range, you know that this takes time. It's not days, it's not months, there's no magic birthday, right? It takes years. And this is actually a very critical and important, distinct developmental stage that historically our justice system has not recognized. And yet many of the elements of this development, which you can kind of see in the orange, are sort of those challenges of being impulsive, peer influenced, are really relevant to the justice system. But so are the developmental milestones that young people make during this journey. Things like meaningful employment, which are what leads to desistance. So I'll be sharing some of the research, sort of highlights of neurobiology, sociology, developmental psychology, and its relevance to much needed immediate justice reform for all youth. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, Lil. So I'm Melissa Murphy. I'm a senior research analyst for the Wisconsin Office of Children's Mental Health. And I'll be discussing issues and data specific to Wisconsin, including outcomes for kids transitioning out of foster care, and while they're at higher risk for homelessness, single parenthood, incarceration. And then I'll also present data for mental health, substance use, and education, which influence the likelihood of first contact with the justice system, including reincarceration and recidivism rates. And then lastly, I'll present Milwaukee-specific challenges for young adults as it pertains to homicides and non-fatal shootings. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. So I hope everyone can join us. You can also tell a friend, and there's still room to register. Am I muted? No. Okay. And we will close for today. Again, a big thank you to all our panelists, to everybody that came today, and for all the wisdom that's been shared. And we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.